One Egyptian theologian defeated the most powerful heretic in the Byzantine Empire, and this Egyptian theologian preserved orthodoxy as we practice it till this very day. And the heretic that he went up against had everything working in his favor. He had imperial power, he had resources, he had influence, he had the ear of the emperor himself. And this heretic's name was Nestorius, and he was the Archbishop of Constantinople. But through pure theological brilliance and unwavering faith, this one Egyptian theologian was able to preserve orthodoxy against all odds. Let's go back. The year is 428 AD, and we're in Constantinople. Nestorius arrives as the new archbishop of the capital, handpicked by the emperor himself. And Constantinople at this time was a pretty big deal. It was the capital of the Roman Empire. It was referred to as the New Rome. And Nestorius started overseeing Constantinople with a bang. He immediately closed heretical chapels, he imposed strict rules on the laity, and he even implied that the emperor's sister herself was an adulteress. And he was so fiery as an archbishop that he earned himself the nickname of Torchy, and people were calling him Torchy. But soon after all this, he starts to reveal his poison. Picture this. You're in the great church of Constantinople, and the church is packed with a lot of people. And Nestorius sends his chaplain to give a sermon. And Nestorius' chaplain makes this proclamation. He says, "Don't call Mary Mother of God. Mary was human, and it's impossible for God to be born from a human." Now, this proclamation shocks the crowd. And what does Nestorius do? Does he see this pushback and repents from his heresy? No, he doubles down. And soon after, a bishop by the name of Bishop Proclus gives a counter sermon and defends the name Theotokos. Theotokos means the mother of God, whereas Nestorius insisted on calling Saint Mary Christotokos, meaning the mother of Christ. Bishop Proclus says, no, we will continue to call her the Theotokos, the mother of God, because if Nestorius was correct in his heresy, which he's not, but if he were correct in his heresy, if Saint Mary was the mother of Christ, but not the mother of God, then that would imply that Christ isn't truly God incarnate. And if Christ isn't truly God incarnate, then that would mean that God never incarnated on earth as a man, which would of course mean no salvation. And while all of this was happening, almost 800 miles away in Alexandria, somebody was noticing what was happening in the capital of Constantinople. Meet Saint Cyril of Alexandria. And the reason why Saint Cyril was so perfectly positioned to handle this heresy head on was because Saint Cyril was the leader of the See of St. Mark, which is an ancient patriarchate. And not only was it an ancient patriarchate, within the See of St. Mark was the Alexandrian School of Theology in Egypt. And that was a big deal because the Alexandrian School of Theology at this time was kind of the gold standard of theology and produced brilliant theologians, including Saint Cyril himself. And he was trained in this milieu. And not only was he good at theology, but Saint Cyril was also really good at diplomacy and building networks and alliances, which would come in handy for him soon in this controversy. Now, fast forward 429 AD, reports of Nestorius and his heresy reach Alexandria, and Saint Cyril makes his first big move, and he writes a letter to the monks in Egypt. And in this letter, he explains the dangers of Nestorius' heresy and his teachings. And this letter was so popular that it spread across the monasteries in Egypt, and it eventually reached Nestorius. And Nestorius, of course, did not like this letter. Now, here he could have repented. Here he could have let go of his heresy, but of course he doesn't. He digs in his heels, and he says even more absurd statements. He says things like, "Don't call the one who became man God." And he says that I refuse to acknowledge a 2 to 3 month old infant as God. And these statements were so scandalizing that even bishops who used to support him were horrified. 2 Syrian bishops in particular walk out on him and will testify against him later. And why this is important is because Nestorius was from the school of Antioch. He's as part of the Antiochian school, which is in Syria. And so for Syrian bishops to walk out on him implies that his very own people are going against him at this point. At least these 2 Syrian bishops were. And Saint Cyril realizes at this point that he has to confront Nestorius with the full authority of the church since he keeps doubling down on this heresy. And so in 430, Saint Cyril writes a letter to Archbishop Celestine in Rome, Now, Archbishop Celestine recognizes the danger of the Nestorian heresy, and he anathematizes, meaning he refuses and excommunicates the ideas of Nestorius. And Pope Celestine, or Archbishop Celestine at this time, denies the ideas of Nestorius directly. And not only that, but during this time also St. Cyril was holding a synod, which is a local meeting of bishops and church authorities in Egypt. And in the synod, they detail the ideas of Nestorius and how they're wrong, and they refute them directly, leaving no wiggle room for him to give a rebuttal for his heresy. Now, the emperor soon realizes the tension going on in the empire, and he calls for the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus. Now, this was a church meeting that brought all the bishops in the Roman Empire together in the city of the Theotokos, where it is said that St. John the Apostle cared for St. Mary. And Nestorius thinks that this council will vindicate him. But we will soon see that St. Cyril came to defend the apostolic faith, whereas Nestorius sees that this is sort of a debate to defend his own ego. And St. Cyril comes to the Council of Ephesus with 50 Egyptian bishops. And the Syrians who were on their way to defend Nestorius were delayed on their way to Ephesus. Now, there are rumors that they were delayed because they didn't want to go to the council. But what was historically documented to be the case is they had hardships along the way, and bishops were getting sick and bishops were dying. Now, on June 22nd, 431 AD is when you had the actual Council of Ephesus, where 200 church officials gathered, and in their midst, the holy Gospels were enthroned to indicate Christ's presence. And Nestorius kept getting summoned to the Council of Ephesus, and he kept refusing to come. One time he refuses, second time he refuses, third time he refuses. And he was hiding amongst imperial soldiers during this time. He was literally blockading himself with soldiers from becoming summoned to the Council of Ephesus. And so the Council of Ephesus occurs. Bishop after bishop testify against Nestorius. They read Nestorius' words, and his own words testify against him. He condemns himself. And then they read St. Cyril's second letter to Nestorius, which is a masterpiece in theology, explaining how it was that God incarnated as man, without confusion, without separation, without alteration. And so the decision at the Council of Ephesus was to depose Nestorius for heresy. They removed Nestorius from the church. And then when the bishops walked out of the council in Ephesus, they were met with a lot of torches everywhere in the streets, and then the entire city poured out onto the streets, and incense was being burned. And these people in Ephesus surrounded the bishops with lights, singing hymns to the Theotokos. They were so happy that Nestorius was deposed, and Nestorianism as a heresy was not canonized in the church. And this isn't just church politics that they were celebrating. They were celebrating the preservation of the truth as it was passed down from Jesus Christ. Now, this isn't the end of the story, because a bit later, John of Antioch, one of the Syrian bishops who was delayed, eventually arrives to Ephesus. They hold a rival council with just 43 of those bishops, and they try to bring back Nestorius. And so this confuses the emperor. He says, what's going on? And during this time then, Cyril sends a eulogiae to the emperor, which were a bunch of gifts to the emperor's court. Now, this wasn't a bribe. This was pretty common during this time, and it was accepted as typical Byzantine protocol. When these things were happening, you would send eulogiae, these gifts, to the emperor in his court. And so Saint Cyril, he didn't stop there. He was seeking unity. He didn't want to just crush his opponents. He wanted the unity of the church. And so he works with John of Antioch, one of the head bishops who was on his way to Ephesus from Syria. And they formulate this formula of reunion. Nestorius is exiled to the monastery, his own monastery, and then eventually ends up in the deserts of Egypt, and he dies there, still clinging to his heresy and his errors. And he refused to give up his heresy. And so till this very day, the Oriental Orthodox tradition keeps the Cyrillian formula. It keeps the St. Cyril's formulation of the nature of Christ, which is one incarnature of God the Word. And he defended against Nestorius and his idea that Christ was two persons or had two separate natures. Rather, he insisted and he proclaimed that the Word was made flesh. And if you walk into an Oriental church today, whether it's a Coptic church, an Ethiopian church, a Syriac church, Armenian church, Eritrean, or Malankara Indian, you will see that the Christ that you meet there is the Christ of St. Cyril, and it's the Christ that was affirmed at Ephesus. And no compromise or contradiction exists in the Oriental Orthodox churches today that affirm Ephesus, whereas some other churches might affirm Ephesus, but they do not hold to the formulation of Christ that was confirmed at Ephesus. And so St. Cyril was one of the most powerful figures in Byzantine Egypt, almost as important as the governor at this time in Roman Egypt. And it was through St. Cyril's theological insight, his pastoral courage, and his political skill that he didn't just win a debate or own Nestorius the heretic, but he preserved the gospel itself. And it is the faith of the apostles that St. Cyril defended that we practice till this very day. And so the next time someone says that theology doesn't matter and it's not important, remember St. Cyril and how he defended the faith and how he preserved it for us till this very day.